We're continuing our topical views of various things that are influenced by secular humanism. We've always started with these couple of slides that talk about the fact that we all have a worldview. And I want to emphasize one point here because I've heard a couple of comments about it. We're talking about secular humanism. When you think about humanism, well, Christians are human-caring, right? You might say we're Christian humanists in that we love people. That's not the point of all this, right? And I actually heard somebody say, well, we should be caring about it. Yes, we should. It's secular humanism. It's humanism that cuts God out, which is the problem and what we've been studying this week. So thinking that you can organize society in a way that does not include God is the challenge in secular humanism. So we've been through this and talking about the topic, and particularly the problem in the humanist worldview is the fact that it cuts God out of the equation. Today our discussion is the philosophical foundation of law according to humanism. So we're talking about, as we have in each week, the influence of humanism on a particular topic. This week it's the topic of law. And we're particularly going to focus on law and order and also the development of laws and how that has been impacted in our lifetime by humanist thinking, secular humanism thinking. And that's going to show up in a couple of different ways. One, both in terms of law and order, but also in the drafting of laws and the interpretation of laws themselves. So our objectives today: understand the foundation of law according to humanism versus the foundation acknowledged by Christians. There's a stark contrast between the two. Understand the differences of law application, the application of law in the legal judicial profession in a humanism context. And this will start helping us understand a little bit about what's going on in the world around us the last 3 decades. Versus in a Christian context. And we'll talk about specific implications for hermeneutics. And if you don't know what that word means, don't worry about it. We're going to talk about it. And then to observe some specific examples of these principles in action, some of which we've already talked about in some of our early sessions on humanism. So one of the ways the world has been influenced around us is our legal system, and our society's response to law has been influenced by a secular humanism mindset. Now, that doesn't mean the majority of people got up every day and said, oh, I'm a secular humanist, therefore I'm going to behave this way. No, it creeps in, right? It creeps in and starts to influence things that way. So, some terms. Law. So, don't get confused with old law or anything like that. Rules and regulations by which everyone in a particular society is expected to live. I think we kind of understand that as the generic way that we think about law. Hermeneutics is the science of interpretation, and we'll spend a lot of time in this. This has had a lot to do with Christian thinking in the last few decades and shifts in Christian thinking, and we'll see how that kind of has been influenced by a humanist mindset. But it also has to do with the interpretation of various documents, law statements, Constitution, etc. And so we'll see how that has kind of come in and influenced the legal framework of our society. And then exegesis is to lead out the intended meaning from the text. And again, that can be talked about in a biblical context, but it's also critical in a legal context. What did the original writer and the original reader understand this to be and be about? Versus what does it mean to me today in a different context? And so exegesis is pulling out from the text what was intended. So those are some terms to keep in mind as we think about our discussion of law. Law and order deterioration. Now, if you can think about this in different ways. You can think about it anecdotally in terms of your own experience. If you're of any age at all, you recognize that law and order, observation of authority, not being anarchic, right? Anarchy, we see a deterioration. We see that. We feel that. One way you can look at that is incarceration rates in this country. Now, I don't know how well you can see that, but beginning about 1980, which is interesting, sort of when I became of age, everything went to pot. I mean, it's like incarceration rate have gone through the roof, right? There's some things behind that. And you can talk about the war on drugs and some of those kind of things, but the exponential increase, there's more to it than that, right? It's not following the law. That's what it is, right? In fact, our prisons are overcrowded, and actually people are being released early because of that. So law and order has deteriorated. Now, to our law enforcement people, to their credit, violent crime has actually gone down. That's because we've thrown massive resources at it and got them all locked up. That's what we're trying to do. Now, you can have an argument, and philosophical and sociological argument about all that, but the reality is a lot more people are disobeying the law than used to. Right? And that's what's going on in our society. If you're in a school system, kid behavior now, 30 years ago, anarchy kind of a thing in some environments, right? And you could just even think about, there are many things that are focused against authority. You even got this started kind of in the 60s, you used to get bumper stickers that say, challenge authority and some of those kind of things. So law and order as a concept has deteriorated over a period of time. And as we go through this, I think we'll see that some of that, at least, a material part of that, has to do with the influence of a humanist mindset because of the drivers of what makes a person obey law. And taking away a key part of what makes people obey law is the issue that we're seeing. Any comments about that chart? Anybody surprised by that? I think we watch the news or whatever, we recognize this anecdotally, right? But here's some numbers that kind of reflect it. Yeah? I think that's millions. Yeah. So we have almost 2.5 million people in prison. Just think about that, right? Now again, there's all kinds of conversations about war on drugs and those kind of things, but still, exponentially, that is an enormous number, right? Other comments? Turn to Romans chapter 13. I want to spend a little time talking about this. So, why the decline? The way people think about law determines the effectiveness of the law. Now, you can say all you want that people obey the law so they won't get punished. But even with your kids, that's not the best answer. In fact, that's the least best answer. The best answer is capturing hearts and minds with your kids. By the way, I'm teaching parenting class again next quarter, so let's plug for that. But anyway, the best answer is to get to the point where, because of their love of fellow man and their love of God, they obey law. That will drive a whole lot better behavior in society. And so the way people think about law determines the effects of law. Humanism teaches that laws are merely a matter of human expediency. This law is put in place because we have decided it's best for us, right? And if we decide tomorrow that something else is best for us, majority rules, right? If you're in the minority, sorry, right? There's no basis for it other than we decided. That's a humanism mindset concerning law. It is an opinion of those in power. Now watch this. Legal punishment can be viewed as the price of social resistance and even martyrdom, not the sentence for actual wrong. Think about things going on in our society, right? Law and order, if your mindset is that this is arbitrary, right, then I can just disobey that and demonstrate my resistance. If it's anchored in God, that's a different thing, right? Those are different mindsets concerning law. And so you can see, again, this is helping to explain kind of what we're experiencing in our society and why those things are happening. Without a Christian worldview, laws are merely someone's opinion at the moment and can be considered undue oppression to be resisted, right? That can be a mindset that occurs. If it's not anchored in something that's fixed, i.e. God, right, His law, then you can kind of go and think that it's just somebody's arbitrary view. Romans chapter 13, and we're not reading this particularly to talk about obeying the law. We're reading it to understand what the driver is behind obeying the law. We're going to read verses 1 through probably down to 10 here. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for as there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for they are God's minister, attending continually this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. This is love. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet, and if there's any other commandment, are all summed up in the saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. What is the biggest driver for law and order that really works? Love, right? Now there's in here conscience of accountability to God. That's obviously important, right? That's the conscience piece. He talks about the first one, punishment. Okay, so the humanists have that. There's Christianity. But there's two more. Conscience of accountability to God, that should create a higher degree of fear/compliance. Because guess what? You can fool the authorities. You can't fool God, right? You can cheat on your taxes and nobody's going to find out, right? God knows. So there's a higher accountability for law and order that comes from a recognition of, I have a consciousness of accountability to God. Therefore, when I'm considering my behavior, I'm not just thinking about, can I do the time, right? What about the eternity time? And then beyond that, love. What does Christianity bring to the table? Love of mankind, love of fellow man, right? And so love of God. And so this is the ultimate thing that Christianity brings as a foundation for law is love for others. Love when it goes through all the 6 of the 10 commandments, which are the neighbor-related ones, right? Those are love-based commands to ensure that we have the most orderly society possible. So when you think about the preference of a legal system that's based on secular humanism versus a legal system that is based on the universal love of God, you're going to get different behavior. You're also going to get different laws, but you're going to get different behavior in carrying that out. And so when I think about why the decline, more and more people have become less accountable towards God and less understanding of the universal love of God, and therefore extending that as universal love to their neighbor, and that has created a deterioration in society, anarchy, and those kinds of things. So that's a big piece of this and something that we ought to be watching for and thinking about that. This is a case where it can clearly be seen that the Christian foundation is way better than a humanist foundation because it drives the right kind of behavior. I think that's right. And then the body of Christ can serve as an extended family for the same thing. So, yeah. Now you're cheating. You're 3 slides ahead now. Come on. You're taking away one of my punchlines. No, I'm just kidding. But you're exactly right. And we're going to talk about some of that. All right. Somebody else that doesn't want to talk about hermeneutics. All right. So just compare and contrast legal foundation. Humanism. Foundation is human reasoning. Human reasoning is the foundation of law. In Christianity, the foundation is revelation from God as to principles and concepts. And we're going to see a couple of quotes from our founding fathers talk about that. Humanism is based on evolving needs of humanity. Okay, so what happens is what's right at this moment as we best determine it. What's right tomorrow is different. Right? That's the evolving view versus absolutes of God and creation. Humanism. Humans are good without restraint, and society is responsible for crime. Have you seen how personal accountability has been taken away, right, constantly, right? I'm not responsible for what has happened to me. I'm not responsible for my decisions. The society did it to me, right? That's the humanist mind. And so we gotta take on society and fix society so these individuals don't behave that way. Whereas Christianity is based on personal accountability. The soul that sins, it will die, right? And personal responsibility for behavior. You can't read the New Testament and not see unequal situations. Just think about the parable of talents. 5, 2, 1. That's unfair. But yet that's God designing it differently. Then the question is, how do you behave yourself inside of that, right? And God knows where you are in that. But there's personal accountability for your behavior and your circumstance and your particular situation and how you make the best of that, whatever it might be. And so big distinction between humanism and Christianity. Now listen to some of the language of humanists as it relates to God as lawmaker. So this is from Frederick Edwards, wrote an article, Without God, How Can You Be Moral? Because they recognize this challenge. And they say, from where does God get his moral values? If they originate with God, they are made up and hence arbitrary. Right? So just think about, that's basically a blasphemy from a Christian viewpoint, right? God is being just as arbitrary as the humanists. There's no advantage, and we are no more compelled philosophically to obey God's arbitrary morals than we are to obey the morals established by our best friend or worst enemy. It is possible for people to develop laws upon themselves, as in law, so in morals, the governed are capable of rule. So this is the mindset that comes into this, right? And basically saying, I want to completely discount any absolutes coming from an outside force. We will decide. We will decide. So this is Romans 1 extreme, the worshiping the created rather than the creator. That's really what's going on. It's a form of idolatry. We will worship human thinking rather than the thinking of God, right? And this is many things, you could quote from the humanist perspective on what they want to base it on, and it's all about humans can do it themselves without any external influences or appeal to any external source, and especially not supernatural revelation, right? So that's the mindset that comes into it. And then, of course, the biblical view, 2 Peter chapter 1, we've talked about this before. Grace and peace be multiplied to you in the knowledge of God. Where does grace and peace come from in this life? Knowledge of God, all right? From right there, you have differing opinions before you even get started, all right? His divine power has given to us all things, including the proper foundation for legal thinking, all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of him who called us by glory and virtue. Just think about two different worlds. One that has leaders that have extreme power. Even our democracy, leaders have extreme power. And exercise that extreme power, recognizing their acknowledgement of accountability to God. You can go throughout our society, whether you're at the president, Congress, whether you're at state level, your local level, whether you're at law enforcement or local town magistrate or whatever, we're shocked sometimes at the bad behavior of people, right? Well, they're not acknowledging their accountability to God. That's where that comes from, right? So now the humanists saying we can have a better society by wiping this away. Now, you want people with power to have a check, and you want them to have the highest check possible, conscience toward God, right? Because what does absolute power do? Absolutely corrupts, right? And you can absolutely get that. And so if we have a world where all of our people that are in power acknowledge God and their personal accountability, you're going to get better behavior among them, leading to a better society. Comments? Questions? Yeah.
When we abandon God, the Christian worldview and abandon God's laws and start following the humanistic view of law, the inevitable conclusion is tyranny and injustice. Mm-hmm. Because like you said earlier, those in power will exert their opinions. And in Micah, it's a perfect example of Israel doing exactly that. So God pleads with them. He says in Micah 6:8, he says, "He has shown you, a man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God."
Yeah.
And then the next 10 verses talks about all the injustice of man to man.
Right.
Whether it's stealing, whether it's violence, it's all there.
Yeah. I think that's right. And, do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. You can't do justice and love mercy unless you walk humbly with your God, right? There's not enough driver. There's not enough force of will within humanity to do it. And the secular humanism takes that piece away. And so you're going to get efforts at good behavior, but it's not going to have the oomph behind it that's required. The only reason you do it is fear of law, and then it's just what you can get away with. And that's not going to make the best of society. So this is interesting. I'll throw this in extra credit, I guess. Think about in the Old Testament view of law and order. So there's only one time that God set up a judicial system, right? In the New Testament, he doesn't establish laws for the judicial system. There's principles, but there's not the laws of the judicial system. You go back and read the Old Testament and go through all that. It's a legal code, right? And it's a God-based legal code. Now, we don't live under the Old Covenant, so that doesn't necessarily apply, but it gives you insights into the mind of God and the way that he thinks about judicial system. He makes some argument that he was doing it to preserve a nation. Might not be exactly the same, but I think it's just kind of interesting to look at this. In the Old Testament, the offender received punishment corresponding to the crime. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, right? Remember that, right? In our mindset, some of that's pretty crude and harsh, right? But it's interesting that is part of it. Punishment is designed, and this is a quote, to purge the evil from among you. So the view of crime wasn't just about the problem of the one who committed the crime. The problem was about its influence on the greater society, right? To get that out, to purify the nation. And so you had that idea. Punishment is a deterrent, the rest shall hear and fear. Another quote, right? The rest shall hear and fear. We actually have a New Testament example of that. Ananias and Sapphira. After that little event, what did it say about the church? And fear came upon the whole church. Yeah, I bet so, right? So That's a piece of it. And then punishment allows the offender to make atonement and be reconciled with society without loss of civil rights. There was no prison system. Right? Under the old law, there's no prison system designed. Right? Now, you got some prisons when you got later with the kings and some of those kind of things, but there was no prison system. Right? There were basically two choices. Pay the penalty or die. That was it. Right? Now we're moving on. Right? That's the way it worked. Right? If you stole a man's horse, you gave back fourfold. I don't know that's the exact quote, but you did something and then you were done. Over. Move on. Right? Kind of an interesting view from the Old Testament. All right. So, why Christian law is superior? It produces order because law is considered sacred. This is the conscience comment from Romans 13. There's a universal standard or foundation for justice rather than power-based, politically motivated, arbitrary standards of the state. Therefore, people are more likely to comply. Right? If you can point to a fixed thing, you're not going to have as much of a debate. You know, you talk about how you're going to measure something, and you talk about how long a foot is. Well, we've got a fixed standard for that. Suppose we live in a world where that just kind of evolves from time to time. Well, this week, right? Well, I want that one. No, I want that one, right? Well, that's what the humanist foundation of law, secular humanism foundation of law is about, is to migrate over time rather than being ultimately fixed based on godly principles. And then human rights and responsibilities. Rights come from God, not the state. Responsibilities to others are inherent, not coerced through the state, like an example of taxation. So why am I benevolent? I am benevolent because of my accountability to God and because of universal love. State-enforced benevolence, taxation, does neither. Right? There's a difference between those two things. And so you think about that and how that comes about. Now, I think that is an incredible view of benevolence, because if benevolence was so overwhelming, you wouldn't need that. Right? So you've got to figure that out, right, and work through it. But that's a different view of what the world looks like. Now think about this. Humanists cannot write that people have certain unalienable rights. Okay? Declaration of Independence. Right? People have certain unalienable rights. That's the foundation document of our country being started. Humans couldn't write that because people don't have any unalienable rights. Because unalienable implies what? A higher authority. King George, we're appealing to a higher authority. Right? That's what was going on. And you can't do that in a humanist context. There's no foundation for that. Right? So that's a different view as well. I won't spend too much time on this unless I tread on Jeff's lesson next week. Christian basis for the United States, much has been written about all that. One Nation Under God's a book that if you don't have, or The Silence of God, both are excellent documents that go through, and they're easy reads and they have lots of pictures. So, great books to look at and understand sort of the foundation elements of the country. Listen to these, I'll just give you two quotes. John Adams: the general principles in which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. Right? That was it. That was how, in a secular humanism, you wouldn't even have the United States. Right? Because there's no basis for it. There's no basis or foundation for it. Our laws and our institutions must necessarily be based upon and embody the teachings of the Redeemer of mankind. Supreme Court. We haven't heard that lately from the Supreme Court. That's 1892. So that's not even way, way back, right? Interesting view. But anyway, Christian basis for the United States, and I suspect Jeff will talk about that some. Okay, let's get to Jack's thoughts. Hermeneutics in the Constitution. How do you interpret a document? Here's the way that you think about something. If you get a letter, you read it, okay, it's addressed to me, and it was signed by somebody, so it came from them. And as I'm reading this letter, I have in context a couple of things. It's written to me and it came from them on this date, right? That gives me some view of what's going on, right? Now, I can kind of ignore all that and just look at the words, all right? Or I can just pluck a sentence out of it, right? That's not proper hermeneutical science. Or as we'll see the words, you can get past beyond the four corners of the document. Well, when they wrote that, well, I'm thinking they were kind of thinking about this over here too. All right, so hermeneutics is the science or discussion of how you interpret a document and look at it. Aristotle's rules of common sense said, what did the original writer intend to convey and what did the original reader understand in their context, and then go from there. And if you don't know what that means, you don't know what the document means at all. But enter non-interpretivism. Courts should enforce norms that cannot be discovered within the four corners of the document. Now, just think about that. Courts should enforce norms that are not in the four corners of the document. This is the second thing that is really influencing our society from a humanism perspective as it relates to law. Because things have to evolve, right? That's the foundational element of humanism, is that things have to evolve. Now, it's interesting that our constitutional founders recognized that things needed to evolve, so what did they do about it? Bill of Rights and the ability to amend it. We can amend the Constitution today. When's the last time that was done? I can't remember. But instead, because that's hard, right? Instead, what happens is we enter a new kind of hermeneutics, a new way of interpreting documents outside of the four corners. Now, this is to Jack's point. This is precisely what people have done with the Bible, right? It's exactly what's happened, and we won't get off on that discussion. Nobody can say, from a biblical perspective, right, come to a completely different thing because they're getting outside the four corners of the document and not thinking about what was originally written, originally intended, and those kind of things. But think about it in a legal context. Do you think James Madison was thinking about pornography when he wrote the First Amendment? Right? No. Right? He was worried about tyranny, right? And he talks about that. It's very clear, right? And yet, we get outside the four corners of the document and we start doing these things and we expand things, etc. That has had a really negative influence on our society. They'll talk about the living Constitution versus the dead hand of the framers. You know what they mean by living Constitution, right? It's evolving, it's changing. Now, there's a way to do that, but we're not going to do that. That's too much trouble. There's a way to do that, right? So this is the evolving humanism coming in, taking the concept of fixed principles out, the concept of God out, and introducing evolving things. So when you hear things, and you read things in the news, you're like, well, how did that judge make that decision? Or how did that happen? This is what's going on, right? You're not saying that the document means what the document means. You're saying the document has to evolve with time, and I have to kind of interpret around the edges. And so you end up with, as some of us said, judges legislating from the bench. Net result, everyone does that which seems right in their own eyes. You can talk about that from a biblical perspective, and you can also talk about that from a constitutional perspective. You know, how many times do we see this court, which is conservative, said this, and then this court, which is liberal, said this, and this court, and it goes rattling all the way up. Well, how are these really smart people coming up with different conclusions? Because they have a different mindset about this principle of hermeneutics. Comments or thoughts you have? Yeah.
As a Christian, looking about the history of nations that have fallen, it's terrifying. Where's that thought process with humanists?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of intellectual arrogance that says we're smarter than that, right? We can do better. And, you know, you can make correlations, and I think maybe Matt did it, comparing this to Nazism, because some of the principles of Nazism were secular humanist based, right? But, you know, that they would dismiss that quickly and say we're smarter than that. We're not going to let that happen, right? So I think that's the view. Yeah.
I think a lot of the mindset discussion, Brad's also very analogous to creationism versus evolutionism, and how scientists can take the same data and come to two completely different conclusions.
That's worldview, right?
That's right.
Yeah, that's right. And I do think law is influenced by worldview, and this concept of if you're if you're in a democracy where the democracy decides on things like the Constitution and the amendment, then that's fixed. Versus others that would say, well, those things have to be interpreted in an evolving manner over time for what's in the best interests of society. That battle is clearly going on. Yeah.
Letter to us, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness.
Yep.
All these things shall be added unto us.
Yeah.
His righteousness.
Right. I think that's right. And the other thing is, and again, I think some of this will be talked about next week, what are we seeking first? Because I'm sitting here talking about nation, but nation is subservient to the kingdom. We've got to focus and recognize that, yeah, this is going on. This helps explain the world around us and what we're seeing, and will help us interact with our neighbors and friends about topics. But we don't get as anxious about that as what's going on with the kingdom, right? We have to think about it that way. Yeah, Tim?
Humanist believes that if the nation falls, then that's all right.
Yeah, probably needed to, because we got to evolve in the next one, right? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Rocky?
I mean, all these lessons are kind of related, and as we've learned from previous lessons, humanism has an integrity towards religion. And so any law, any principle that's perceived to be associated with religion, they're automatically biased against that. And so what we see is kind of a systematic dismantling of the laws across the land, and having kind of a semblance to being associated with God's word. Because me and you in private conversations have talked about this before. I think there's been a co-opting of the idea of freedom, and it's been redefined by humanism to be something that it was never intended to be, and that is they turned it into lawlessness, they turned it into licentiousness. And that's what they're doing. They're systematically eliminating all the restraints that society has previously had on different behaviors and making it a free-for-all where people can do what they want to do. And to go back to the humanist thinking is we can make our own laws because we can figure out what's best in society. Go back to your graph.
How's it going? Yeah, that's right.
And we could come up with many other graphs if we had time that shows here's all the adverse consequences of removing impediments to people doing evil things.
Right.
How's that working?
Right, that's right.
This is the consequences of your decisions, and they don't want to do that.
That's right. But it gives us a basis to have a conversation with our friends and neighbors about what's going on around us. And this is to Rocky's point. I use some of these in very much the introduction, but here's what the humanist says. Traditional moral codes fail to meet the pressing needs of today and tomorrow. We urge that parochial loyalties and inflexible moral and religious ideologies be transcended. That's you and I. Concept is the Bible's outdated, does not address the real problems faced by people in the 21st century. We need to evolve past this, right? And so it shows up, and we see that in our legal system. We see that in what's happening. Ethics is autonomous and situational, right? That's another key thing here is, and oh, by the way, in the corporate world, there's a lot of conversation going on about ethics and culture. Can I say a bank's name, right? So there's a lot of that going on. These kinds of thinking contribute to that. Right? And it's not just banking industries. Lots of industries are struggling with these things. When you say ethics is autonomous and situational, you lose your rules, standards, fixed lines that you never cross. It's to enhance freedom and dignity of the individual, including in recognition of individuals' right to die with dignity, euthanasia, right to suicide. So now this is the whole discussion about sanctity of life, right? And so we can rip that one out. And so you can go on. And these are some of the things that we see in our legal system that are shifting, and you can probably think of many more because of this kind of change in it. So again, what do we do with this? We have conversations with neighbors that talk about, and I would really hit that first part, on the best way for the best society is for people internally to recognize the universal love of God and therefore want to extend that love to their neighbor. And if you have that mindset, law and order becomes easy. Take away God, you don't have that. You don't have that. And then, of course, you also have accountability to God as a secondary one. And so as we talk to people in the unchurched about the things that are going on in the marketplace, if you will, and why we as Christians are concerned about it, this is why, because we see it. Yeah.
Interesting when you talk to people who have more of a humanist mindset. So some of their arguments, I can give some credence to. Like, it's like, okay, I can see where you're coming from. But other arguments are sort of circular to me. So, for example, one of the big ones, you talked about, hey, the Bible's outdated, whatnot. One of the big ones right now in society, as you know, is homosexuality, right? So a humanist would take the point, it's like, hey, homosexuality, there's nothing wrong with homosexuality, it's normal. The Bible says it's not okay, so the Bible must be outdated. Right. But you're presupposing that it is okay, right? And one of the other things that really irks me some is we as a society have begun to focus on the individual greater than the society as a whole. So one of the things, like in anthropological studies, is they go out and they try to find an exception. And then they say, well, they point to an exception, right? So like they'll find some tribe in New Guinea or something. It's like, hey, homosexuality is practiced here and it's accepted. So that must mean that it's okay for all humans. Well, at what point does an exception to global norms, or at least, the majority of the world, indicate that this is okay for all of society?
Right. No, that's good. I think that's exactly right. And these are the kinds of conversations you got to be armed with to be able to have, loving conversations with your neighbors about, what's going on. All right, so we won't have much time to go through this, but I'll just remind you of some things that are foundational, again, to, the Christian viewpoint. We already talked about 2 Peter 1, Mark 12, shall love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? It begins there. It all begins with love of God because he loved us, and then love of neighbor, which, in this particular topic, creates naturally law and order, right? That's what it does. Think about the 10 Commandments, the 6 of them, right? Those are really all about loving your neighbor. That's what they're about. And so if you've got that drive in you that recognizes how much God loved me, and I need to extend that love not only him to my neighbor, our work here is done, right? That's what will do it. And so having that mindset as a foundation is key. Galatians 2:20, who, crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, etc., Christ in me. But that topic is really, who am I at my core, right? And so if that's who I am as a core, then again, it's a foundation that works very well. Colossians 3:17, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name, and you might as well just plug in there, by the authority of Jesus Christ, right? I think we're going to spend some time in future quarter on authority and flesh that out a lot. But again, if your foundation is that, then all the rest of it falls in place easily because you've got an anchor. You've got an anchor for society, you've got an anchor for the church, you've got an anchor for your family, etc. And then finally, I'll just flip through to Proverbs 3:6. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Think about that in terms of law and government and society. All right. Appreciate your attention. I think our time is